I actually went down mainly to get my license plates yesterday for my new car. And I stopped and saw my friends, Lucy and Nancy, who asked about Linda and Amory, by the way,
Good.
particularly.
Hello to them.
I said you would appreciate their mention.
Yes.
And I had been invited there for Thanksgiving dinner, and we decided that in another instance where discretion is the better part of valor, and came back and had dinner by myself. So I had good company.
I was going to say no arguments, but perhaps there were.
Yeah.
At least you won them all.
So Amory, shall we jump into poem?
Yeah. Okay, we held over for today, Parable of the Hostages. I'm going to be school marmish here for a moment. Definition of parable.
Oh.
Anybody?
Go for it.
No, anybody? Students, anybody?
Well, having been prompt, I have this ancient book that I had, and I think I got in 1961 when I was in college. So it has a definition of a parable, a short narrative from which a moral can be drawn, such as Christ's tale of the Good Samaritan. It may, but may not be an allegory wherein, say, each character stands for an abstraction that otherwise would be hard to grasp. We know parables a lot from the New Testament, but how does that work with Parable of the Hostages?
I heard a definition of it many years ago. A parable is a moral fable. That's it.
Except in the
and
reading,
I think, Linda, what you read is kind of an elaboration of that.
except in the reading I was doing this morning, they made a distinction between parable and fable, saying that a fable is the main characters are often animal or even plant, but non-human, like the Aesop fables with the fox with his head stuck and the turtle and the hare and so that led me also to reading about allegory, where the point is that particularly the main character stands for some being or identity beyond themselves. And all of that is to say, I thought it was interesting that the poem we had talked about last week was a religious term for a title with morning prayer, and that this retelling of the Greeks sitting there at the wind up of the Trojan War, she chooses to call a parable.
And I think it would be interesting to discuss when we get during or at the end of it, what exactly the moral is that we're supposed to draw from this, or if there are several. I haven't thought about that until this minute, but I think that's interesting.
This is fairly long, but maybe it would be good to hear. Ron, do you want to read about the first half of it?
All right.
And then Linda, would you pick up wherever he leaves off? Do you have it in front of you? Okay.
Yeah, we discussed this at our coffee break this morning before the meeting.
That's
Ron
what the two of you were doing. You were rehearsing.
Yeah.
Okay.
I will say that when I just by way of, I think, of context, that each time I've read this poem, I've had the same feeling as looking at a Bruegel painting, where the routine of life intrudes upon the mythic and heroic. We kind of ask ourselves, what would these people really be like to know?
Yeah.
So, Parable of the Hostages. Interesting choice in the word parable, but also hostages. The characterization of the Greek in the title as hostages.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
hostages
the Greeks are sitting on the beach wondering what to do when the war ends. No one wants to go home. Back to that bony island. Everyone wants a little more of what there is in Troy. More life on the edge, that sense of every day as being packed with surprises. But how to explain this to the ones at home to whom fighting a war is a plausible excuse for absence, whereas exploring one's capacity for diversion is not? Well, this can be faced later. These are men of action, ready to leave insight to the women and children, thinking things over in the hot sun, pleased by a new strength in their forearms, which seem more golden than they did at home. Linda?
Some begin to miss their families a little, to miss their wives, to want to see if the war has aged them, and a few grow slightly uneasy. What if war is just a male version of dressing up, a game devised to avoid profound spiritual questions? Ah, but it wasn't only the war. The world had begun calling them, an opera beginning with the war's loud chords and ending with the floating aria of the sirens. There on the beach, discussing the various timetables for getting home, no one believed it would take 10 years to get back to Ithaca. No one foresaw that decade of insoluble dilemmas. Oh, unanswerable affliction of the human heart. How to divide the world's beauty into acceptable and unacceptable loves. On the shores of Troy, how could the Greeks know they were hostages already? Who once delays the journey is already enthralled. How could they know that of their small number, some would be held forever by the dreams of pleasure, some by sleep, some by music?
Well, I had already scribbled all over my copy, and now I scribbled in a different color on about 16 different places. Where to start? What about Ron's question about the title, not just parable, which is the one that I picked up on, but hostage? Hostage to whom?
There's a large question that the poem, I think, takes up. To whom are they hostages? And is it more to themselves than even the place that they've come to? You know, Penelope is the great hostage to the suitors back home. And when the poem talks about to the ones at home, to whom fighting a war is a plausible excuse for absence, the way she's presented as so dedicated in purpose and loyal to Ulysses, Odysseus, it'd be interesting to have a treatment of the people back home. We get it somewhat actually in Tennyson's poem Ulysses, where Tennyson asked, what would it be like to put this hero on a throne and watch him become a crotchety old man, trying to deal with the vagaries of life of the people he rules.
To answer Ron's question, it seems like we're all hostage to the routines of the average life and to being caught up in what we think will make us happy. But we're also hostages to our dreams of what we want, the excitement of being famous, of being on the edge of doing something that's really important. I think those are both hostage situations because we never live them out. They just hold us.
But I think that that's brought up in the last line. Some would be held forever by the dreams of pleasure, some by sleep, some by music. So held hostage by that. And it's all really interesting when you think that they're the hostages, but the Greeks won the war. And so the Trojan War, so it has a lot of double meanings there.
I think she gives us a close-up to the Greeks. We read about them from afar in time and in terms of culture and in terms of their heroic exploits. And then she takes a close look and we see, of course, that they were people of ambivalence and angst. And it's a very different way of looking at the classical world.
Mm-hmm.
What hadn't struck me until I was listening to the two of you reading this, even though I've read it so many times now, she as poet and us as reader know the rest of the story. These men who are sitting there think that their problem is, how will I quickly slide myself back into the humdrum life? They don't know, as we do, that it's going to take 10 years for them to get there. They may have won the war, but they're going to, many of them are that aren't lashed down well enough are going to take off with the sirens, and those monsters on either shore are going to gobble up a bunch of them, and all those. We know that, so we know more about their being hostage than they do.
Is this the song, How Are You Going to Get Them Back on the Farm After They've Seen Paris?
Well, they think it is.
Yeah.
But they think Paris is just what's gone on in Troy. And we know that their biggest adventures are still ahead. Poor guys.
Reminds me of being in the military. Sometimes we would have to, I was on a submarine, and so we would, the mission was to go to sea and, patrol around for months. And then we would pop up different places and stay there for a little while, then go back under and finally make it back to home port. But it was that energy and that excitement that even when you were getting ready and you didn't know what your exact mission was, but you had to get the sub and you had to get everybody ready to go to sea, how everybody could come together, even though we had, you couldn't categorize anybody on other than saying that we were attached to the submarine and we each all had a certain purpose, but there was a different kind of camaraderie on the sub when we got together and the sub left the port. It gets underway. There's just these different phases that happen in that. And when finally you let the air out of the ballast tanks and the sub dives, and you know that you're underway and you've detached from, your families, your girlfriends, your kids and everything, but there's no choice in what you don't really have any decision over it. You've signed up for that. It kept kind of vacillating between that time on the submarine when I read this and how that we just pulled together. But being of that age, a lot of us were between 18 and 24 years old. There were older people there, but your youth you're fearless, and you have all these adventures in front of you, but somehow this was a new adventure, and it was going to take you away from your life at home. It's going to add some flair to it. And then when we got to ports, what was interesting was like the married guys were the ones that you really had to contain. They were out there just having a really good time, doing the wildest stuff, and getting in the most trouble.
I didn't know you had been on a submarine. That's fascinating. Those of you who are particularly poets, what are you seeing in terms of how she puts this together? What are we all seeing in terms of what's being said?
I think she's a master at the line break.
Say more.
Well, I was looking, at the third line. Want to go back? Wants to go home. Back. You're stopped at. Wait a minute. Home is back. What does that mean? I'm not going forward anymore. This is retrograde. This is inferior. What is? But just that infosecond with having to pause at back. Just opens up. But the same with life on the edge, that sense that every day is being. You're left with every day is I just exist, and then it goes on to explain it. But to stop to stop the thought at being, I was great. She does that a lot in this poem.
I enjoyed reading it because I read it differently out loud than when I just looked at it with my eyes. And it flows. I feel like you do, Lynn, that the line breaks are perfect, but then when you read it, it all flows so nicely, and the subsequent phrase embellishes that stopped line before. It was different reading it aloud.
We think of the heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey as having these grand purposes and this dedication, loyalty to one another, big abstract values. I think the poem is an exploration of their sense of purposelessness.
You too.
And she gets into, there they are. They've been drawn to the war. It's not really even much of will that has brought them there. And now they have to decide what their next steps are going to be. And like the other poems that we've looked at by her, there's this series of, it's almost cyclical exploration of the situation.
What I thought was interesting in regards to structure of her poem was it's a long poem. It's 10 sentences, and she completely punctuates it. It's completely punctual. She's got periods. She's got question marks and commas, and then she has the audacity to include in 2 lines back to back. She's got a semicolon and an M dash. So I'm like, what? So she's got, it could take 10 years to get back to Ithaca, semicolon, but she breaks it down to a new line. It's like, why put a semicolon in a poem when you could just break that line? Because it's like she's drawing attention to the fact that this is a sentence and a semicolon is needed. And I'm just baffled by that. And then then in that second line, no one foresaw that decade of insoluble dilemmas, M dash, not a line break. She doesn't go to another line. She says M dash, unanswerable, and then goes on and on and on. So I thought that was interesting because she's got these 10 sentences. She's breaking them up in strategic places, but then in those 2 lines, she's got those particular marks, and I'm just kind of thinking on that. I'm trying to figure out what's going on.
Well, what often follows the semicolon is further explanation or exploration, and I think that's what she does in the poem. And the semicolon is this series of further penetrating into the nature of their experience.
But I mean, this isn't a paragraph, a traditional paragraph, and this isn't a story in a book. This is a poem, and a poem, that is, your lines connect with each other naturally and relate to each other. I guess you could almost put a semicolon at the end of most poetry lines. And that, if you follow that logic, I think, I don't know what to think of it. I'm trying to figure, is she, I don't know.
Shannon, when I was teaching writing through the years, I used to tell people that if they use semicolons, they become better writers. That is one of the things that they could practice that would force them to become more incisive. And the title of my lecture, which I would read to the students, is "The Semicolon is Your Friend." So it's apparently can be a friend to poets as well.
I was put off. Well, first of all, I want to mention my very 2 favorite lines, which were, What if war is just a male version of dressing up? I thought that was just an incredible insight. And then the next one that you've just been citing, that decade of insoluble dilemmas. There's so much in that, so much to think about within those 4 words. But I was really put off, yes, by that M dash and then O unanswerable stuck out there. There's no comma after O, and O just seemed so weird to me, like something out of a melodrama, that it bothered me.
Oh, geez. And there's a colon between hard and how on the next line. What?
Yeah.
Triple threat.
Where are you, Linda and Shannon? Where are you?
Well, about 10 lines from the bottom of the poem. No one foresaw that decade of insoluble dilemmas, O unanswerable affliction of the human heart, colon, and so forth.
And Linda, you say you were initially put off by it, maybe still are. Did I hear you right?
Yeah, the O unanswerable part. It just seems flung out there, and maybe that's the purpose of it. It looks untidy to me compared to the rest of the poem. Just looking at it.
It's very.
Did she want us to untidy our mind there and pay attention to these lines?
Well, that sounds like a good poetic explanation, but I would still have rather had it be on the next line. No one foresaw that decade of insoluble dilemmas, dash, O unanswerable, and then affliction of the human heart. But
if I had retyped this, I would be really nervous that I had made an error, but I copy and pasted. So this is the punctuation as published. This isn't,
right. Yeah.
This isn't Amory's fumbling.
No, it's the same in the book too. I'm reading her book, and it's exactly the same. So it's on purpose. What is she?
I'm sure it is. It's my shortcomings as a reader, I'm going to assume. Unless all 6 of you agree with me, then I'll know we're right.
As a reader of poetry who doesn't read a lot of poetry, I'm very appreciative of the punctuation because I use it to help me look for meaning.
Yeah.
First of all, I look for it to help me know how to read it aloud, because I've been trained. You read it as you would read something that has periods and question marks and breaks and so on.
Well, I thought it was interesting, her intermittent use of the length of the line. I mean, I don't know if you've already talked about that, but I just thought, in addition to the punctuation where she chose to have those line breaks, I don't know if that, it kind of makes you stop and start on, at different times, at least for me. And then it made me dwell on some of the lines a little bit more than I would have if the line breaks were differently. I think Shannon said, maybe these were they had to have been strategically placed, but that's what I got on that.
We're talking about poetics, but the power of her statements and just the crisp thoughts, that line where Linda, in a few, grew slightly uneasy. What if war is just a male version of dressing up, a game devised to avoid profound spiritual questions? Almost all our literature about war focuses on what it does to the participants and the stresses it creates and so on. But then she follows that up with, but it wasn't only the war. It's not dismissive, but there's this whole context in which the war is only a segment. The war had begun calling them in an opera. There on the beach discussing the various timetables for getting home. No one believed it could take 10 years. There's all of this that happens to human beings in war and around the war. You know, the things that trouble us as human beings.
It's so interesting the way she then uses an opera and then folds in, beginning with the war's loud chords and ending with, I just love the inclusion of musical terms and associations in that following passage.
I particularly, well, the contrast to what you're saying, the big opera, is that in the beginning there, no one wants to go home, back to that bony island. So bony meaning there's nothing, you know, on that island for anybody to get, and everyone wants a little more of what there is in Troy. So there's no pickings for them on the bony island, but Troy at least offers them something a little bit in addition to that. So now, then we come into the opera of the war.
Is a little bit nourishment, Michael?
Yeah, I think starved. You know, you're on the bony island. You're starved for lots of things, not just food, but probably nourishment. Just the adventure that, you know, you see that your life is laid out before you. There's not going to be that much happens. So the idea of war and conquering, you know, excites, especially I think people who are in that, you know, younger age bracket and think that, you know, they don't have a future otherwise.
Mm.
And
You know, I'm thinking, you know, about the whole concept of purpose when I actually engage in something that I would call a purpose outside myself, something that serves something larger than myself. There is a kind of excitement, kind of a sense that you have a reason for existing. And so to me, it's tied to the idea that we said originally about this poem being about purpose, to the whole concept, you know, the moral concept of living your life purposely.
without having to do any of that annoying thinking about it or analyzing it. I was struck the end of the first page and the start of the second. Well, this can be faced later, all of these consequences. These are men of action ready to leave insight to women and children. So first of all, honoring them as I'm out there fighting and really trivializing thinking about what this all means. I mean, if we're going to let women and children do it, it's certainly not very important.
You know, as I read these poems and reread them, there are a couple of, for me, large thoughts come into mind. One is that when I first read this poem after the others, I thought this is ambitious. And then I've reread the others and thought they tend to do many of the same things. And I went back and realized that writing about your parents' relationship and writing about the ostensible act of weeding and gardening can be very ambitious poems as well. I mean, exploring those experiences. I almost became a history teacher, and I always had a suspicion that most of the history that's been written, well, we like to say that history used to be written by white men about the exploits of white men. And a lot of history up until certainly the 20th century was exactly that. History is an extended exercise in the reductive fallacy. Historians tend to say this happened because this happened because this happened, or this was the purpose of certain men. Charles and Mary Beard write a book called The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution because they were landowners and wanted, primarily, they fought the war and led the fight so they could settle the land west of the Appalachians. Well, contemporary historians are looking more and more at the fabric of people's lives and describing for us just what their lives were like without necessarily attributing purpose to them. And I think that's the look she gives us at the history of the Trojan War. Not all of our grand ideas about purpose and so on, that's our stamp on it. Lynn, you were going to say something.
I think that we need a definition of purpose, because nothing exists without a purpose. If an ant isn't serving some purpose, they become extinct. Everything has a purpose, but there are grand purposes, and there are levels of purpose or something. I don't know exactly what I think about it. I'll draw a picture, but
Of course you will. Well, how is purpose relating to the poem, are you thinking?
these men are struggling with what's the purpose of life. Is it to have a family and be bored on the farm, or is it to go out and see Paris? To enjoy your life, to be excited. What is the purpose of life?
If you go back to the title, Parable of the Hostages, what's the moral that we draw from this poem?
I think that I love that word hostage as for a soldier, because they signed up, they were recruited or whatever, and they're thinking, okay, we're going to go fight this war and I'll come home. And they get kind of transformed into like pirates. You know, that's a long time to be gone from home. Fight a serious, huge war. Not all of them survived the attack on Troy. And then they have to travel around the Mediterranean for 10 years. Not in some, you know, they're totally different people. They've been taken hostage by a completely different lifestyle.
And they're still hostages.
Yeah. I was curious about the last two lines. Because she talks about their bondage. She talks about what is their tether, their handcuffs, so to speak, their jail bars. Some would be held forever by dreams of pleasure, some by sleep, and some by music. I explored those a little bit, and I'm curious what other people think about those three ways you can be captured. I interpret that as sleep meaning denial, and that music might be the rhythm of being a soldier, because someone's telling you when to get up, when to exercise, when to go rush that hill.
The lines that come before that, you know, the word enthralled is used. How could the Greeks know they were hostages already? Who once delays the journey is already enthralled.
Semicolon.
Semicolon. So what are they enthralled by, and why is it important that a small number of them would be held even more strongly hostage by pleasure, sleep, and music? I was jarred again by the ending. Why did she end there?
In a lot of our lore and in our literature, the dreams of pleasure and sleep and music, maybe physical pleasure, these are escapes from and usually freeing experiences, liberating. And she presents them as continued entrapment.
The ending of this, in fact, the whole piece of it comes back to that question that I often ask: how much am I expected to bring to this poem? How much should I already know? And to me, this poem can't make complete sense unless you are familiar with the Odyssey, unless you're familiar with the story of the 10 years. Because I think Shannon is certainly right that those things that are named there at the end could be symbols as she described them, but they are also specific instances that they're going to face. You know, they had to plug their ears at one time,
Right.
so that they couldn't hear. They had to lash themselves so that they wouldn't flee to the sirens.
You know, Amory,
He who hasn't read this stuff in 30 years.
you've always been pretty honest, frank, that you come to the poetry and the discussions as someone as a novice.
Mm.
And you know, I think somewhere along the line, I should have at least said this. When I first started teaching poetry when I was 21 years old, I was so damn scared I was going to get asked a question that I couldn't answer that I probably purposely directed the conversation, the dialogue with the class to make sure that damn well didn't happen. And as I
Keep them
as I
talking.
got older and became more confident in my teaching, I did not acquire a feeling that I really knew a lot. I really just acquired a feeling that I could probably be equal to this. And I was no longer afraid to say, gosh, I don't know, I'll do some research on that, or I'll think about it some. And, you know, we're all novices with this stuff. And this will sound like I'm going pretty far afield. I used to tell my students, don't take notes. If you do a research paper, don't take notes on the stuff you read in the encyclopedia, because you'll end up plagiarizing. Just read the encyclopedia article to find out what the average person is really expected to know about this subject. So, and I think that applies some to the poem. That does Louise, is it fair for Louise to think that most of us know that it took Odysseus 10 years to return, and some of his men didn't make it? Actually, he's the only one who made it, now that I think back on it, which is an interesting problem.
Well, don't you think this poem is like most, that you bring your own experiences to it? And if you've you know nothing about the Odyssey, you've never heard any of this kind of stuff before, you would still get something out of this poem.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I think so.
I agree.
Actually, it's more about us than
yeah,
it is
if you
about
have
them.
read them, but you will get something.
Well, I think you get a lot out of it, even if you don't know about, any Greek history.
Well, Ron just said, actually, it's more about us than it is about them. And I think that's right, because these are all themes that daunt us or should daunt us.
Yeah.
So in that last sentence, semicolon, question mark, I thought, when I read that about my third or fourth time reading through it, what I came away with is that we're just all different in what we get out of this. And we don't know that we're, our differences, even though we've come together with the glories of war. But once we leave the war, and once this, campaign is done, then we're going to leave and we're going to go back, and we're going to have to learn to do something else. And we're going to be enthralled by dreams of pleasure, some by sleep, some by music. And most of us not ever getting, reaching the goals that we initially aspire to.